Good evening. My name is Bishop Brian, and thank you all for joining us tonight. My sense is, since tonight's the one chapter's on silence, that maybe the best way to think about prayer tonight would not be to pray now, but that we'll pray at the end, and let our prayer at the end be maybe a few minutes of sharing silence together, since the chapter talks about the gift of both praying alone or praying with others in silence. So we'll plan to pray our way out at the end, if that's okay this evening. So when we said let's have a book discussion during Easter season, I was hoping maybe a couple people might take us up on that. And this was, I think, a lot more people than I imagined that would be with us. So thinking about kind of how we'll do tonight's discussion, if it's okay with you all, I will maybe give some rationale on why this book, why now, how it might be useful to us, and then move into some conversations around the introduction in the first chapter. Again, I want to say thank you for being a part of tonight. There is a chat space. On the one hand, I think I recognize most of these faces as East Tennesseans. If there's anybody else here who's not from East Tennessee, we'd love to know where you're from if you're with us tonight and not from our diocese or not from this region. My hope is this book is going to be useful to you both in this conversation, in your own life, in the places where you live. So I'll say a little bit about how this book came on my radar to maybe get a sense of why this conversation seemed important to me. Recently, the Diocese of East Tennessee and the Diocese of West Tennessee, our clergy gathered for a Lenten retreat at St. Mary's Sewanee. And Lisa Sanuda, who's a priest from the Diocese of Kansas and is in charge of spiritual formation in that diocese, came and spoke to us and did a great job leading us in a conversation on contemplation and impasse. And in leading up to her being with us, she and I had several Zoom conversations in preparation. And at some point, I asked her, so what are you reading right now? What sort of books are important to you right now? And she mentioned this book, The City is My Monastery. It's just a really important book for her, thinking about her work and trying to help a diocese think about spiritual formation and going deeper in their faith. And so I got a copy. And as soon as I got it, I thought, I think this is a really timely book for us. As your bishop, and as your bishop now in my sixth year with you, and now on whatever side we are of the pandemic, my sense is that many of us now sort of taking account of where we are, of how we're connected to the parishes and the ministries that we serve and that animate us. We're either recovering and thinking, oh, last Sunday felt as good as Sunday 3 years ago, and sort of celebrating some threshold, or we're seeing the health in our communities, but maybe realizing we're smaller, we're a smaller group of core folk. Maybe we're feeling energy, but what's the future? If you saw the advertisement to consider being a part of this book study, one of the conversations and the questions was, what is the future of the church? And as your bishop, I've spoken about becoming an accidental contemplative when I was a teenager. I grew up in the Baptist tradition, and in the Baptist tradition, my particular church, there was always sound in worship, right? There was music, there was preaching, there was a Sunday school report, there was testimony. I never connected a contemplative sort of silence with worship and the Christian tradition. And it wasn't until I was a teenager, my first paying job was I was a church janitor at my church. And so a lot of times, washing windows and cleaning toilets in a sacred space by myself. And so the experience almost kind of backing into the awareness of, in that sacred space where there was silence and just me, I really felt the presence of God and had a sense of God is here without anyone speaking, without anyone singing, with just me as a teenager in awkward teenage body, feeling God's presence and God's love and God's grace. And from that day to now, I'm increasingly convinced that whatever we have to face as Christians, we really start that from a contemplative posture and a contemplative grounding. So it makes sense to me that we're reading a book about thinking about how to create just a more intentional rule of life, and understanding that it has to start with a contemplative ground, contemplative foundation. So my hope is wherever you are in your particular ministries, if you're clergy, if you're lay, in a particular parish, particular ministry, and so often when we think about the idea of call, it's a sense of I'm here and I feel called to do some new thing elsewhere. I feel called to go, away, to move physically, or to leave something. Again, what I found helpful about this book, and what I think it's helpful for us right now, is this is a book that I think calls us to consider the place where we already are and to go deeper into that place. So as Richard Carter realizes, I'm going on a retreat, but I'm actually going to go back to London and be there in an even more intentional way. To me, is I think where we are right now as Episcopalians in East Tennessee, that our call in 2023 is to be open to not that next call for you simply to be where you are, but to approach it in an even more intentional, clear, grounded way. That I think maybe before the pandemic, maybe those ministries that we were attached to had some kind of inertia. Maybe I could assume they'll always be there, whether I'm there or not. If I show up, okay. If I don't show up, okay. I think increasingly I'm convicted as your bishop that whatever we're going to be a part of in the diocese now has to be with a real intentional choice, right? That if this ministry cares, if you care about this ministry, care about the parishes you serve, the parishes you worship, that it's that intentional recommitment, regrounding in place that we need right now. I continue to believe that God moves in the world. I'm aware that if you kind of read sort of data from Religion News Service or other places, the data and the trends will always say to you the church is in some kind of decline, regardless of what kind of church it is. And so I think along with that sort of data and those trends, you and I then still have a choice to say, okay, that is true. So what is it that I'm going to do about my own spiritual life or the own communities that really matter to me? So while we have data and trends, to me, what I find helpful about this book is just the intentional choice of, so how is it that I'm going to ground a religious life in a community? And so I think, to me, this is a really helpful book because while he has the context of London and the city, I would encourage you all to think about your context. If you're in Chattanooga, or if you're in Knoxville, or if you're in Morristown, or Kingsport, or Jefferson City, or small town, rural community, wherever you are, to have a sense of that is the place you're being called to kind of called to stay there and to go deeper in that place. My sense too is, when we think about the world that we're living in right now and the level of change, the level of chaos, the level of uncertainty, so often I've heard it said, it was at the end of the Roman Empire that you have the rule of Benedict emerging. So kind of a world that's falling apart, a world of great uncertainty, but what emerges are a group of Christians who are committed to praying together, living together, working together, studying together, resting together, to kind of have to create an alternative temporary world for a moment as the world is in flux. And my sense is wherever we are in the world right now, it feels like a lot of change, a lot of influx moments. And I feel that as your bishop, but also as someone committed to the idea that God still moves in the world. My sense is all the more can we create an intentional ground for our ministries. So a few things I want to say, and also I'm glad to see where y'all are connected to. Also at some point, and Brother Andrew will be checking this, as I keep speaking, if there are questions that do come up from the readings, at some point we do want to have some time for that tonight. Also, as a way to get ready for next week, I would encourage you next week, as we're going to be reading the next chapter on service, to consider if you have questions either from this week's reading or next week's reading. If you want to go ahead and send those to Brother Andrew, then for next week, those questions can be queued up. So we can kind of be prepared to already kind of move into more of a discussion and not just me talking. phase would be, I think, my invitation for next week. So think about the questions you might have from the readings that you'd want to send to us. Also, something else, I think a way to read this book that he suggests at the end of the first chapter is to really think about this book being a book that you journal with. My sense is how he uses his own poetry, his own kind of reflective writing, that as you're reading these passages and pages, to consider what response you're getting. So for you to journal as well. And you might want to share some of those journals with us. They might be too precious and too private. You want to keep them to yourself, but I want you to feel the invitation for you also to think about how this is impacting you. So again, a thing about contemplation, I think to me, any sort of posture in the life of the church does begin with silence, because it begins with, I think, a kind of prayer life that really is open to God's grace, to our reception, to being open. For me, so often in my life as a Christian, I'm aware how often I function out of a works righteousness posture, right? That if I do these 6 things for Jesus today, he'll give me a list next week of 10 more things to do. And that's always about sort of earning favor with God or earning favor with others. And to me, I think for this book to say we start any kind of intentional community together in a contemplative posture is just an acknowledgement that we have to start with God's grace, that we are people that are loved by God. God chooses us. God chooses to work through us. We are imperfect people. But I think if we don't start with that contemplative ground, so often we're going to start out of kind of a reaction, out of a need to be loved that really is about kind of making use of the other, not treating the other for who they are, can really be in sort of passive aggressive postures with that. So if you look at I'll just jump into this. In the forward, I guess page 13 in the forward, this is a book about what it means to be with God. Something else that's also happening right now in the life of the church, increasingly folks who are considering becoming monastics in any traditional model, that is in deep, deep decline. So I was recently at a monastery in South Carolina, Trappist Monastery. And while I was there, I was hearing about the closing of 2 monasteries in the West. And increasingly, when you're, I think, visiting monasteries, those numbers are in decline. And so on the one hand, the idea of being a monastic, a monk, is one who chooses to be one with God. So we think about, the number of monastics in the world are dropping and diminishing. But I think both the invitation and the desire for many of us to be one with God, I think that actually is growing. It's just that we're not necessarily saying, I feel called to do that in a traditional monastic way. So I think also this book is an opportunity for us to say, what would it look like if that practice of that monastic tradition got lived in new models? So again, for you to think about a small group in your parish, are you on an individual posture, or a church school class, or a reading group? So I think, again, a book about being with God, I think so often for so many of us, the temptation is, in order to be with God, there's all these things I have to do, all these tasks I have to accomplish. I have to have this great missionary zeal. I have to kind of do all these things for the kingdom. And again, I think it's why we start with contemplation, to say, we have to begin to start with that just sense of, I am a child of God. I am loved of God. God has chosen me. And that silence, we increasingly know silence is such a healing posture, right? It's good for us physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, to experience silence, to not have constant chaos and noise and sound, but to have those moments of silence. And so I think all the more to think about in your life. Hopefully the idea of silence has been healing and holy. I'm aware that for some of us, we have to kind of work through maybe the idea of silence as a negative. People talk about being silenced, or if your voice has been silenced in your life, if you've seen yourself isolated or silenced, obviously then the idea of seeking silence is a negative thing. Or if we think about at times, maybe when we give some sort of punishment to children, we sort of send them to their room, go sit in your room by yourself. And so I think for some of us, the idea of silence feels like a punishment, feels like I've been cut off from people. So I think for some of us, we might have to kind of go back and reconsider how silence has shown up in our lives. I know maybe for some of you, silence was a walk in the woods as a child, some sort of healing, wonderful time to be by yourself and to get lost in a book or to get lost in a walk. But I want to acknowledge up front that for some folks, silence is not some happy invitation, but it feels like a punishment. It feels like isolation, which is why I think also if we're going to think about the contemplative life and community, we have to find a way to move from loneliness to solitude. He sort of mentions this in the book, that for some of us, the idea of being, that contemplative posture might feel like loneliness, might feel like isolation. So that my concern always is if the lonely, isolated person seeks community, they end up doing that out of a posture of some sort of lack or a desire to be with others, but maybe not to be able to be with them in a well-boundaried, healthy way. So I think a part of this healing for all of us to think about how we build a contemplative posture in our life would be to have a sense that it's only in contemplative healing silence can I move from Brian Cole, maybe who's a lonely person, to Brian Cole who's experienced some sort of solitude. So it's from that place of solitude, that place of like, I am enough, that then when I encounter the stranger, the friend, the church member, the colleague, I do so not in a grasping, needy, you complete me sort of way, but I do that from a place where I feel strong, I feel whole. Merton talked about in New Seeds of Contemplation that the contemplative doesn't go into the desert to avoid people, but to know how to find them and to know how to really be with them appropriately and in a whole way. So I would say if in starting this book, if the chapter on silence is challenging to you, that again, I think the intent is to say it's from that ground that everything else grows. And I would definitely say that, to think about a contemplative posture, contemplative prayer, honoring silence, this is not an introvert versus extrovert sort of thing. This is not about personality types. I think all of us, regardless of how we're built and wired for people, all of us really need that place of silence and healing in order then to think about how we engage the world.
So, Bishop, there
Yes.
is one question that has come up, which you may somewhat have answered, which is what is your understanding of contemplative or being contemplative?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I think a contemplative basically is someone who is, it's a person who seeks to be one with God, and realizing that seeking is less about seeking and desire. It's more about being open and receptive, so that the contemplative understands God is already with us and can sort of wake up to that and wake up to that awareness that we are one with God. And so often the rest of our life kind of invites us to believe that that's not true. So I think as a contemplative, we start with just some really basic, simple things of God is with us, God is choosing me, and hopefully each day or each time throughout the week, I find places just to receive that and to accept that. I think a contemplative is also someone who is able to live in this moment. Again, I think so often in the life of the church, we either have some sort of, we look in the past, there's some sort of, we're so have this sense of nostalgia for the past. So we're kind of always looking back. Or some of us maybe have a great fear of the future. What will the future look like? Or some anticipation of the future. Oh, if I can just do these 5 things, then everything will be well. So I think so often as humans and as Christians, we're either stuck in the past or looking for the future. And I think a contemplative is able to focus on what is in front of me right now. what is in front of me right now is, I think, a true contemplative posture. Obviously, any of us too, and I mentioned sort of being accidental contemplative as a teenager and discovering kind of that sense of God's presence. So I think all of us are built for contemplation. It's not so much a spiritual gift as it is a practice. And I think the more we sort of practice contemplation, the more we can kind of grow those contemplative muscles and contemplative places in us. I think for some of us, again, the fear of silence, the fear of being by myself, the fear of in some ways, I think some of us have some comfort with the distraction and the noise. So obviously, sometimes that choice to be a contemplative can actually be a pretty courageous choice. It doesn't maybe look all that courageous, but I think it really, in many ways, isn't a desire to say, just to sit and receive God's grace and God's love and God's mercy is enough. So let me also, this also just a thing that I want to reiterate from the introduction. This would be like 24 and 25 about sort of, we talking about Benedict and the school of love. He said, and I'll just read this to you all. It will actually involve not doing more, but doing less, but each element with more attentiveness and joy. It will involve letting go of some of those elements of your life that you do not need, a turning off of the stuff that is dragging you away from where you want to be. Literally, a turning off at sometimes of the mobile, the computer, the television, the agendas, and habits that are depleting you. It will involve a slower and more attentive way of living and practicing the things that bring consolation, hope, and thanksgiving. You will find that the cure to your sense of meaninglessness and loneliness is solitude. So again, that sense that when I'm feeling that isolation, when I'm feeling like that sense of loneliness, you would think, oh, I just need, I need to go get people. If I'm just with people, that will solve it. And so often I think what happens is if I'm in that place of isolation and I just go and get people, there are times that I've felt, deeply, deeply alone in a crowd, right? Because you're still disconnected. You're surrounded by chaos, you're surrounded by noise, maybe you're surrounded by fun, but in that moment of feeling your lack, all those people don't fill the hole that's in you, because the hole that's in you is, again, are you open to receiving God's grace and joy and mercy and forgiveness and healing? And then from that sense of, I am a child of God, seen by God, I have that place of solitude. It's from there that I join the crowd, join the community, can really contribute to it in a whole and healthy way. So let's look at, I'm going to wade in then to the chapter on silence. And again, I have a son who always kids me about, dad's going somewhere to talk about silence again, right? That's always kind of ridiculous of like, here's more conversation around silence. But I do think in the Christian tradition, this is such the real gift. You think about Jesus saying to Mary and Martha about Mary sitting at his feet, that Mary's chosen the better part. She's chosen the better portion. I think so often, this great gift is right in front of us as believers, and yet we do so many other things and avoid kind of what is that intention when we encounter silence. And so he mentions, Brother Roger from Taizé on page 2, when he says, I have nothing to say. Let us keep silence, for God will speak in the silence much better than me. That so often I think it is in silence that we really can pay attention to the work that God's already doing in us and wants to do in us, and realize that so often that desire for a deeper spiritual life, all the tools are already there. We just often leave and get distracted from encountering those tools. So he says on page 5, silent contemplative space is the ground which everything else is nurtured and grows. So I think too often when we think about a contemplative posture, it's set against sort of the active life, right? And that somehow we think contemplatives are walking around critiquing people's activity or critiquing people's outreach ministries, or you're just being busy. And that is not true. I think so often It's out of that contemplative posture, that contemplative ground, that people are called to work with the homeless, work with folks dealing with addiction, to do, definite works of mercy and justice. It's said that when John Lewis was about to walk across the bridge at Selma, if you've ever seen those images of a young John Lewis, and he has that backpack, well, in that backpack, he had a copy of Thomas Merton's New Seeds of Contemplation. And to me, that's such a wonderful image to think about. Here's this young man, this activist for civil rights, this young man about to put his life on the line. And the book that was nurturing him as he thought about this active posture was a book written by a monk who lived in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky. And so for a young John Lewis, a young African-American man, who would not have grown up in sort of what you might think of as a traditional contemplative life, grew up in the very active life of the Baptist church, yet saw in Merton and Merton's writings something that would feed him as an activist. And so to think about the courage to walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge is somehow nurtured in that contemplative silence and posture. So that if you're here tonight and you think about maybe several active ministries you're a part of, in no way, please don't hear sort of a contemplative posture as some critique about activity or the active life. It's always going to ask us, so why is it that I'm, acting in this way, or responding in this way? But it's not going to say we should all just walk around 24/7 in silence and all find ourselves in a monastery, but to realize the balance, right, of when silence calls us to speak, or when silence calls us to act, after the speaking and after the acting is then the call to go back to the silence, right? To kind of keep this cycle of prayer and action, this cycle of silence and engagement. So again, John Lewis on the Edmund Pettus Bridge with Merton is a classic example of that. So he also mentions in this book, so something that I want you to know about this book, especially in this first chapter, how much he references a book by Martin Laird. So this is a book by Martin Laird, Into the Silent Land. And Into the Silent Land by Martin Laird is one of the best books I've ever read on Christian practice of contemplation and centering prayer. So if a part of this study for you and reading for you, if in any way centering prayer or contemplation, a contemplative prayer feels new to you, he makes several references to Martin Laird's book. I would strongly encourage you to get a copy of this, because to me it is accessible. Martin Laird teaches at Villanova, so he's teaching young people how to practice centering prayer and contemplation. We think about young people today who've grown up in such a tech frenzied world, who maybe are constantly being stimulated. So to think about a priest who's able to teach young people how to do centering prayer, he's definitely somebody with some gifts. The one thing he doesn't mention on page 10 and 11, he gives some basic ideas about how to practice sort of a contemplative prayer, centering prayer. Typically, when I think about folks who do centering prayer, they think about that being from like 20 to 25 minutes. Obviously, if you've never had experiences of centering prayer or contemplative posture prayer, again, that might feel like a lot of time. So it might be that you'd want to wade into growing a longer amount of time to pray in silence. But all the steps he gives as far as what it would look like, how to find a place to sit, how to breathe, how to think about prayer words that allow you to kind of stay focused while acknowledging, all those things are going to come to you. The people are going to come to you, or the things you forgot to do yesterday will come to you. To let those things come there and not beat yourself up for having those thoughts, but to let them go. And to let them go, I think, in such a way that, again, is that contemplative reminder that in this moment, in my prayer, God is with me, God loves me. I don't have to grasp after something. I don't have to get caught up in a bad relationship or a poor friendship or a fractured situation. That in that process of prayer, hopefully I'm building what I need and then to encounter what healing might look like in those relationships. So I think a part of how you build a contemplative rule, a place of silence, is that prayer by yourself. So some of your day is praying by yourself. He then moves on to something I think is really important. Um, he, he talks about kind of the idea of praying in silence in church. And we have a lot of beautiful churches in East Tennessee, a lot of beautiful sacred spaces. I don't know how many of you have had the experience of being able to pray just in a church space that maybe also is a busy, active Sunday worship space. But I think to also be in those spaces at times when no one else is there, and to go in there and to pray, and to think about the folks who've been there before, the folks who are there, the folks who would come after you. To me, the experience of praying in silence in a church is a pretty remarkable experience, and I would highly recommend folk doing that. He also does an important thing about, I think recently I was speaking to a colleague, and in the conversation they used a word that they were just absorbing things. And I'm aware that at some point for all of us, there's a limit to how much you and I can absorb. So if you think about yourself as being a sponge and you're absorbing, be they good things or bad things or people's projections or people's wish you would do this or wish you wouldn't do that, I think we hit places where we can't absorb anymore. So that a part of a contemplative prayer life is a place both to let go of distractions, to acknowledge them, but it's also a place, I think, to kind of allow yourself to kind of let go of the things you have absorbed that maybe aren't so much the distractions of your mind, but the projections of other people, and to get clear about what is it I can carry so I can carry this life for the long haul, as opposed to if I'm constantly carrying what other people have put on me, that is going to be a life that's going to not be whole and not be strong. On page 30, when he talks about praying the shape of the day into being, I think what I would say in reading this or reflecting on this, to me, I think this is why it's important as much as we can to have times in our lives when we can go on retreat. And that retreat might be a monastery, that retreat might be, here's a plug, the new Grace Point Retreat Village. Just to be somewhere that allows you, because I think what he says is so often, you have your life, I work, I have family commitments, I do all these things. Like that's the real world. And occasionally I fit in a prayer, I'm praying in the traffic light or I'm praying before a meal. To me, I think kind of thinking about how prayer can shape your day, I think when we can have those times of retreat and maybe be in a place where the day really is anchored by prayer. So when I encounter monks and I think, okay, here are these monks who pray in the morning, pray mid-morning, pray at noon, pray in the afternoon, pray in the evening, pray before bed, you then realize that's a life where prayer sets the schedule, and it's the work and the rest and the play and the other things in my life that happen in the midst of the prayer. That's my dog, who's quite excited that my wife is coming home from shopping. But it's that sort of anchor of all the prayer in your life that then allows you to take that kind of posture back into the real world, back into your daily life. So I think occasionally to have those times of retreat help you to have that sense of what that feels like. I think again, yes. Mm-hmm.
There's a question that I have that I'll iterate instead of typing it, which is maybe to have you just say a little bit more about the impact of prayer on the day's schedule. Because one of the things I found in going to the monastery is that you actually can still get a lot done in a day that's structured on prayer. If you want to
Yeah.
say something about that, maybe.
Yeah. So I think we don't, at least let me speak to myself. I think if you were to really say to me, Brian, let's look at how much time in your day really is not used well because of how much time you spend fretting about the thing you're going to do, or avoiding the thing you need to do, um, find yourself stuck in the past, thinking about the future. I think so much of a given day, no matter how productive we think we're being, a lot of time could be lost in our minds, right? Fearing things, hoping for things, wishing for things, distracted by things. And again, I think a day that has, and typically in a monastery, when they're praying, they're not praying for really, really lengthy amounts of time. They're often quite brief prayer services. But it is just that communal, we're going to go back and focus on prayer. We're going to be in this moment with God. And my sense is, I think a part of what it means to be a contemplative is to be deeply grounded in reality, right? So when I'm deeply grounded in reality, then after I come back from that, then that next task that arrives, I can approach it in a realistic way, right? I don't have to make it bigger than it is or smaller than it is. It is what it is. So I have found that I think the more you think about those rhythms of prayer, the more present you are, and the more I think you can over time train your body and your mind and your heart and your soul to be in the moment, to let go of just constant anxiety, or to tamp it down and to treat it appropriately, or to allow yourself not to get so stuck in some nostalgic past that you're chasing after something else, but to be in that moment. I think when you do that, I think you just become a more productive person. I think you use your time more wisely. I think also a kind of constant prayer life is also a kind of a daily kind of discernment, right? So you're kind of always discerning like what's real, what's important, what's a priority, what's not a priority. I don't think we do. I don't think you want to have a prayer life to make yourself super organized. And yet I do think in a prayerful posture, you begin to see, here's the thing I've been avoiding. I need to not avoid it. So out of a prayerful place, I can face it. And again, let it be right-sized. And then just realize that, I've heard it said of the Dalai Lama or Rowan Williams or these other sort of folks that we kind of all live with maybe some sense of awe of who they are. And just, again, how much of their days are just soaked in prayer. And yet these are incredibly productive, thoughtful, engaged people, but who really just anchor themselves in prayer. So the other thing about praying together and praying alone, I think on the one hand, it's wonderful if you have a place in your home where you pray in silence and you encounter silence. I would also say if you've not had the experience of centering prayer with the community, praying with the community, there is something powerful about that. In Asheville, North Carolina, and Lexington, both communities, I had circles of groups that I prayed with in silence. And often we would gather early in the morning, pray in silence, and then people would leave. The bell would ring, people would leave, get in their cars and drive away. So these were often folks that we weren't spending any time actually having conversations together. But over the course of those months and years together, there was a deep kind of knowing of each other. And that deep knowing only came from the fact that you and I sat in a circle in downtown Asheville for 25 minutes every morning. So I do think there is something powerful when we think about communion. Merton's going to Asia. He talks about how to think about communion as not simply communication. He's about to go to places where he won't understand the language, and yet hopefully he'll have a deep sense of communion with people that will transcend language. And I would say that for us to think about a community that can kind of be anchored for the long haul, I think it's that contemplative anchor, that contemplative center that allows you then to work through conflict, or to work through dry periods and strong periods, or to work through loss and grief, because you've had those moments where you've had communion without words. To me, something grows strong in us when we can have those sort of experiences of with people in silence in a prayerful posture. And again, there might not be any real words exchanged besides just you and I are together in a life of prayer. Let me also say something about, I think what's on page 43, a time of creative encounter. I think particularly right now in a culture that can feel so fragile and so many things in front of us are ugly, um, gun violence that mars God's beauty, things that just keep breaking our hearts. I think that that need to find creative encounter and understand it as a contemplative act. When I was first ordained, I worked with the homeless in downtown Asheville, North Carolina. And it was for me my first experience of working with homeless communities. So lots of addiction, lots of um, lots of death of young people, lots of setbacks, lots of heartbreak, lots of folks in jail. Just a whole lot of experiences like people's deals not working out, right? Just fracture upon fracture upon fracture. And something I sort of fell into, if you've ever been to Asheville and Biltmore Village, there's an antique store in Biltmore Village. They do French antiques. And somehow at some point, going to that antique store and walking around and realizing all I could afford was like the bookmark, right? I mean, I couldn't afford anything. Like I'm not in here shopping, but I was in there basically walking around and just encountering beauty and just encountering things that had lasted. You know, this homeless guy I'm working with has been sober for 7 days and is now, disappeared again and is full into his addiction. But I can go look at that chair, and that chair is 300 years old, right? Somehow that chair has endured. And so for me, it was the experience of kind of walking around, encountering these antiques that sort of would help me sort of refill my soul to then go out and again and work with God's children, God's beloved on the street community in Asheville. I think if I had not found that creative encounter of like, I need to see beauty, I need to see these antiques that have lasted, I would have been in a much more diminished posture. That at some point that encounter with beauty was really important for me to feel grounded as a believer. Brother Andrew, I've got a couple more remarks. Are there any questions that other folks are having?
There's not any currently, but I would invite anyone that might want to line up a question to place it in the chat box. Or, of course, you can email me at the end of the meeting. I'll send out my email to everyone again, just so you know to email me. So go for it with your extra commentary.
Okay. So again, I think a part of this book now is to think about what it looks like for us as individuals, as folks in parishes, but I think also in this sort of connected way on Zoom, as intentionally putting down roots again in the places where we live. And I think that begins with again that contemplative, prayerful, silent posture that acknowledges not simply the sitting of centering prayer. It is taking the walk. I think a part about walking in nature, walking in creation. For me, I think we think about how busy we can get with our social media. I think how much time we spend, particularly in our cars in a place like East Tennessee, it's when we can also walk that we sort of see the world in a human scale and can see each other in a human scale. And so, I think if for you, the contemplative posture is not more easily found in the centering prayer room, maybe the place that you begin to kind of nurture that is the walk around your neighborhood. That becomes the place where you encounter God's beauty, God's creation, where you can be in this moment now. I think I appreciate the fact that he gives you a variety of ways in which to encounter a contemplative silence. And the idea of, practicing silence, he invites us to practice silence for an hour. Again, that for you might feel like so not possible. So, he's going to turn me into a monk. But again, I think in a time where so much of what comes at us is deep brokenness, deep chaos, and I think particularly in communities, so often we're invited to react to each other. I mean, we think about how increasingly social media and these platforms are intended to create reactions. And the more that we react against each other, while it does great harm to us as humans, it often drives the economy of social media. So to me, to think about how we as believers nurture a contemplative posture is to understand a real countercultural move, right? To thinking about being present in order then to respond to each other. When I encounter the person that I disagree with, if I can respond to them as opposed to react to them, I probably maybe can have a better outcome of some real exchange that allows us to see each other as human, that maybe moves to some new place where I'm converted, you're converted, we find some new path together. That to me, I think we think about a sustainable future for the church and for us as humans, that contemplative center, that contemplative anchor really is not like the last thing you do. It really is the first thing you do. So I think a book about community that starts with contemplation might seem like an odd thing, but I think we really have to work on our own work, that own individual work, that healing that happens in contemplation. It's from that whole place that we then move towards a place of community. There is a question.
Oh, it's a good question. Do you have
Asheville.
it?
Oh, I love it. Asheville is not exactly London or New York. What role does urbanity specifically play in grounding spiritual practice? Is it just any setting for spirituality outside of a traditional monastery like Gethsemane? Yeah. So, I think a part of the book, obviously, he's where that the church where he's in London is, in the heart of London. So I think to me, be it Knoxville, be it Chattanooga, be it East Tennessee, I think any place outside of a traditional monastery can have its own kind of noise, own kind of chaos, own kind of distraction. So obviously, London's and New York's are extreme examples of that. But I think even in the places where we live, anything that allows us to kind of fill our life up with stuff that's not simply being one with God, at some point, again, turns us into sort of human doings and not human beings. Have you ever heard that before? So I think the city, I think the town, I think anything that's not the monastery can have its own kind of distractions. And I think for us, a part of wanting to use this book was to say, even where we are, we can develop those sort of monastic places in our lives. And I think a part of what he does too, and I think in the book, is he sees those distractions. It's one thing if I'm in a centering prayer posture and I'm distracted by thoughts in my mind. That's a distraction. But I think in a city or in a town, when I encounter other people, those other people aren't distractions. They become places where I'll learn God's grace, God's mercy. They push me, I push them. So I think in that regard, simply to claim your place, and knowing that regardless of the size of the city or the town, it has plenty of things to distract us. And all the more, it also has, according to how we reframe it, it has everything we need to find God's favor and God's love. And what also happens often in monasteries is when people go to monasteries thinking, oh, I'm going to go there and get away from all my problems, or I'm going to find this incredible, spiritual bliss. Again, people often run there and all the stuff they're dealing with just shows up, right? So that the monastery itself is not some, geographical cure. It's just a place to go to do the work. But even in a monastery, you can get distracted and not do the work. So the space itself is an important starting place, but it's not the whole place. You made the point that even driving around, yeah, because I think also just in driving, a part of me where I think it's helpful to think about walking and contemplation. At some point, just if we're constantly moving 65 miles an hour, at some point we were moving at a speed that really God would be somewhat surprised at, right? That a part of me taking on what a human can handle in a particular day, at some point to have some experience of being in my body and wondering at what speed can my body move? My body can ultimately move at a walking pace. and to allow myself to be in that, and for that to be enough. So I'm going to try to one last question here and then have some time for some silence. How do you deal with your mind wandering during centering prayer? So again, I want to super endorse this book, Into the Silent Land. I think Martin Laird does a great job dealing with that. I think what I would say is, and again, he deals with this in the first chapter on silence, is, it's important to have that prayer word, that phrase, the Jesus prayer, that you kind of use as a way of focusing. When you find yourself your mind wandering, first of all, you don't beat yourself up. You're not doing it wrong. You haven't failed at centering prayer. If anything, you're really allowing those things to bubble up, because they're going to bubble up. And it's just to kind of let them be there and let them go, and kind of, here comes, that person I'm thinking of, let it go. And hopefully sort of let it go as a blessing, but just to kind of keep coming back to the prayer word, keep coming back to the prayer word. So just to know your mind's going to wander. I don't think that, so the goal is not, I'm going to get to some place where my mind never wanders. It's this, pool that, is completely still. Like, that's not what's going to happen. So I think you're always going to have those sort of wandering thoughts. Just let them show up and then let them move on, and just don't get stuck. I think the hope is not to get stuck there and spend your whole time there. Though realizing again that does happen, and to not let that be a sense that you somehow failed at contemplation. So I'm going to invite us to take some time then to, this is one last thing from Jamie Quattro. I found that pairing my breath with the Jesus prayer, breathing in on Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, breathing out on have mercy on me, a sinner, really helps. I would agree with that. I've recently found, what's the phrase I've been using? Christ in me. I think Christ in me, me in Christ. Again, sort of think about both sort of the way that we're hidden in Christ and Christ is in me, to kind of play with that phrase, those two kind of competing phrases, to both have a sense of the times I want to be hidden in Christ, but also Christ is in me. I think kind of those phrases that, and again, I think it needs to be your phrase, but I think your phrase with breath is a way to kind of go deeper in yourself. And again, that can help with that sense of distraction, but also just to know that the distractions acknowledge that it's also like acknowledgement that you're human, right? We get distracted. The point in prayer is not to become God as much as to be one with God. And distractions are the things that we have to kind of get rid of over time. And we will with more prayer. So I'm going to invite us now we're going to sit for about 4 minutes as a way of just bringing this night to an end. A couple of things I'm going to say. I hope you can join us next week. If you've just gotten the book and not read it yet, again, the introduction in chapter 1 is a good place to start. Next week, we'll look at chapter 2 on service. If you have questions or insights or things you want to share as a way of starting next week's conversation, please send those to Brother Andrew. And thank you for being a part of this. And let's have some time of prayer, and then I will pray us out. Let us pray. Loving God, we know you are always present with us. We ask for more opportunities to know and trust that, and to be present to you and present to each other and present to ourselves. Bless us to this night as we prepare for a new day tomorrow. May this night's rest be blessed and holy and refreshing. And may tomorrow greet us with a new sense of your creation in this season of Easter. All these things we ask them of Jesus the Christ, who holds all things together. Amen. Blessings on you all. And again, be in touch with Brother Andrew with questions. Consider how you might want to use this book and journal with the book. And also, please let me know if others can't be here tonight, that folks can come in and drop out as they can during the series. Blessings on you all.